Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Michigan. For those of you who are not already here, welcome to our Zoom audience on this beautiful snowy day in Ann Arbor. It's nice to see so many of you in the room, and I understand we have a very large group on the Zoom as well. My name is Stephen Ratner. I'm a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School, and I also have the honor to be the faculty director of the Donia Human Rights Center. The Donia Human Rights Center, which was created through a generous gift of Robert Donia and Jane Ritter 5 or so years ago, is the university's focal point for the study and practice of human rights throughout the campus. The Donia Center offers summer fellowships to undergraduates and graduate students, organizes monthly panels and lectures such as the one we're having today, and funds other opportunities for faculty and student work and research in human rights throughout the campus. Our guest lecturer today will be Alice Nderitu, the Undersecretary General and Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide, who will be speaking about the role of genocide prevention in combating racial injustice. I will leave the introduction of Alice to our moderator and commentator, and I will introduce her, and that is Ambassador and Professor Susan Page. Ambassador Page and Professor Page is a professor of practice at both the University of Michigan Law School and the Ford School Weiser Diplomacy Center. She's a graduate of University of Michigan undergraduate, go blue, as well as Harvard Law School. But even more important than those, she has herself a distinguished career in the practice of international law and human rights. She started with me in the State Department Legal Advisor's Office too many decades ago to remember, and she moved on to higher level positions in the Department of State, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and the U.S. Charge d'Affaires to the African Union. And then most significantly in her career as the first U.S. ambassador to the newly independent South Sudan. And she was, of course, the perfect person for that position because she was intimately involved in the negotiations that led to the independence of South Sudan, working for the African Intergovernmental Authority on Development Secretariat for Peace, which is part of an international organization in the Horn of Africa. She's also worked on UN peacekeeping missions in Sudan and rule of law issues on UN missions in Haiti, as well as a variety of other issues concerning the rule of law and human rights. Susan was our MLK lecturer 2 years ago in a wonderful lecture that also can be found on our webpage. I will pass the baton to Susan. She will explain a little bit of how we'll handle the Q&A a little bit later on in terms of the people in the room, the nice crowd we have here today, as well as those of you who are online. But now, without further ado, I pass it to Susan, who will welcome us and introduce our speaker. Thanks very much for coming, everybody.
Is it on? Yes. Okay. It is a great pleasure. First of all, I must say it's been great to be back at University of Michigan. I had a wonderful time here as an undergraduate, and this was a building that I was in quite often, although I don't remember it looking anything like this. And I was also across the street a lot because I was an English major. So this is kind of like my comfortable place. I'm really pleased to introduce to you one of my sheroes, Alice Wairimu Nderitu. And welcome to all of our guests online. So I will say karibu to everyone and welcome. So Alice Wairimu Nderitu of Kenya is the Undersecretary General and the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. Ms. Nderitu is a recognized voice in the field of peacebuilding and violence prevention, having led as mediator of armed conflicts and in numerous reconciliation processes. She was one of the first African women to sign peace agreements as a mediator, actively contributing in defining the role of women as mediators of armed conflict. How could you not like that? She served as Commissioner of the National Cohesion and Integration Commission in Kenya, as well as founding member and co-chair of the Uwiano Platform for Peace that pioneered the use of mobile technology and conflict analysis to encourage citizens to report indicators of violence, linking early warning to early response. She was previously the Director of Education for Social Justice at Fahamu, a UK-registered charity in Oxford, head of the Human Rights Education Department of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And I'll just note here that last year, the MLK Junior lecture was given by Makao Matua, who is also of the Kenya National Human Rights Commission. And that can also be found on the Donia Center's webpage. She is also a founder of Community Voices for Peace and Pluralism, a network of African women professionals preventing, transforming, and solving violent, ethnic, racial, and religious conflicts worldwide. She served as a summer faculty at the School of International Training Graduate School in Vermont in Brattleboro, and taught the Socioeconomic Rights course at Pretoria University's Center for Human Rights in South Africa, and the online course on early warning for the Auschwitz Institute of Peace and Reconciliation. She is an Aspen Leadership Scholarship recipient and a Transitional Justice Fellow, Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa. She is the recipient of several awards recognizing her commitment to peaceful conflict transformation globally, especially commending her innovative approach to mediation of armed conflict. The awards include the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice Woman Peacemaker of the Year, Global Pluralism Awardee from HH, His Highness the Aga Khan, and the Government of Canada, and the Simon Fraser University Center for Dialogue Jack P. Blaney Awardee for Dialogue. She is widely published and is the author, among other books, of The Companion for Women Mediating Armed Conflict in Communities and Beyond Ethnicism, Exploring Ethnic and Racial Diversity for Educators, book chapters, and the seminal paper Getting to the Point of Inclusion, 7 Myths Standing in the Way of Women Waging Peace, which is co-written with Jacqueline O'Neill. Ms. Nderitu holds an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Keene State College and a master's degree in Armed Conflict and Peace Studies and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Literature and Philosophy, both from the University of Nairobi. So after the Undersecretary General gives her talk, we will take questions from you, the audience, and I will give more instructions as we get closer to that time. Without further ado, Excellency, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to go from there? Okay.
As you wish.
Thank you very much.
I think we should have some applause.
Ambassador Page, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be introduced by you. You say that I'm your Shiro. You are my Shiro. And for years and years, I've appreciated you and the work that you do and followed your career. So thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And thank you so much also to Professor Stephen Ratner, who I met because of the work that we do. I'm grateful for the work that he's doing in Ethiopia right now. I'm grateful to you for giving us to him to do the kind of work that he's doing in Ethiopia. And I'm also grateful to be here on this snowy day. Like it's, I truly think it's very beautiful, even when I'm outside and with my suitcase. I still think it's very beautiful. I don't think I'll ever get enough of seeing this kind of snow falling and just marvel at how beautiful it all is. So I would like to begin by speaking with much humility, first and foremost, and paying tribute to all those living and all those whose memory we have an obligation to preserve, who've been subject to racial injustice, cruelty, inhumanity, including the commission of the most heinous of crimes, genocide. And this tribute is an essential part of the duty of memory we all share, which constitutes a sacred obligation for humankind. So I thank once again the University of Michigan's Donia Human Rights Center for having me and for having my great friend and mentor, Professor Makao Mutua, last year. And for the honor to give the annual Martin Luther King Day lecture. It's an incredible honor, incredible. So this year, 2023 marks the 75th anniversary of the December 9th, 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is the first human rights treaty adopted by the General Assembly, followed one day later by the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. In the same year, in 1948, at 19 years old, Martin Luther King was graduating from Morehouse College with a degree in sociology, and he entered Crozer Theological Seminary for graduate studies. And in the same year, in 1948, Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian pacifist and leader whose methods would inspire Martin Luther King on violent resistance in the campaign for the independence of India, would not live until December to see the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, as he was shot and killed in January 1948. So Gandhi's work for racial justice had begun while living in South Africa, when he was subjected to racism through the laws that defined rights based on identity. His mother, Putli Bai, had brought him up in religious practice, of which a key tenet was nonviolence. So global challenges and opportunities for the prevention of genocide often present contradictions. 1948, for instance, presented a situation of a world that ushered in its first human rights treaty, a treaty the core of which spoke to the need to end the injustices such as racism that led to what is often referred to as a crime of crimes, genocide. While in the same year, 1948, an election in South Africa brought the National Party to power on a platform of promoting racial injustice through a policy known as apartheid, cementing in law the theory and practice of racial discrimination. So the term genocide had been coined but just a few years earlier in 1994. Many of you would know the story of Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, because he wrote a book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, in which he describes combining geno from the Greek word for race or tribe with side, derived from the Latin word for killing. And in coining the name genocide, Lemkin was challenged by the fact of the existence of a name for the crime of killing one person, murder, and none for the killing of 1 million people. And so he asked, why is the killing of 1 million people a lesser crime than the killing of an individual? So Lemkin developed the concept of genocide partly in response to the Holocaust, in which 49 members of his family, including his parents, were murdered, but also in response to previous instances in which entire nations and ethnic and religious groups had been destroyed based on their identity. So for Lemkin, genocide signified not one, but a coordinated plan of different actions aimed to annihilate and aimed not as individuals in their individual capacity, but at individuals because they belong to a certain identity. So he would spend several years lobbying governments to recognize genocide as an international crime. It's very well documented. When I'm walking on 42nd Street going to the office in the morning, I think about how many times he walked up and down because it's so well documented, lobbying people. People considered him a pest as he lobbied. And in 1946, genocide was recognized as a crime under international law by the United Nations General Assembly. Genocide was codified for the first time as an international crime 2 years later in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And the preamble of the convention recognizes that at all periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity, and that international cooperation is required to liberate humankind from such an odious scourge. So Article 1 of the convention is very important because it states that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law. And it's a point that we need to keep emphasizing, that genocides can happen in a time of peace and in a time of war, which then differentiates genocides from conflict or from war, because it means you don't have to be in a war for genocide to happen. So Lemkin writes of his mother, Bella, who homeschooled him, finding in literature condemnation on violence against entire peoples on the basis of their identity that she couldn't find in religious teachings. She informed Lemkin's thinking that human beings could affect a change in morals through their treatment of each other and an intellectual approach aimed at addressing the refusal to accept the destruction of entire peoples as conquest. And so later in life, Lemkin tried to provide the moral compass his mother pointed out to him in works of literature through international law. So 75 years since the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted by the General Assembly, various incidents continue to be proof of the existence of racial injustice. Sadly, with evidence of how precarious the existence of especially some minorities is, even among the most seemingly secure majority, and sometimes even in instances where the discriminated race constitutes a majority of the population. So we must therefore confirm that the answer to what Dr. King framed as the basic question which confronts the world's oppressed, how is the struggle against the forces of injustice to be waged, is needed even today. So as the United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, I wage the struggle against these forces of injustice through a mandate that requires of me to monitor and raise alarm to the United Nations Secretary General, to the Security Council, to member states, and to other relevant actors on the risk factors of genocide and related atrocity crimes. I also raise awareness on the causes and dynamics of atrocity crimes and support member states and other relevant actors to promote prevention of these crimes. I also advocate for the universal ratification of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. I support national efforts to incorporate obligations under this convention in national legal systems, build national mechanisms to monitor prevention and accountability for atrocity crimes, and also support the provision of capacity building on the prevention of genocide and other atrocity crimes. So my office also strengthens and supports community, national, regional organizations and actors involved in preventing genocide and other atrocity crimes globally. You would know that my mandate was created by the United Nations in 2004 in response to the failures of the international community to prevent and respond to the genocide in Rwanda against the Tutsi in 1994, and in Srebrenica, Bosnia-Herzegovina, against the Bosniak Muslims in 1995, despite the fact of genocide and the prevention of this crime having been a part of the international legal framework since 1948. The mandate that I hold, which is on prevention, not adjudication, has enabled the United Nations and international community to have a much better understanding of risk factors and early warning signs of atrocity crimes. So on a daily basis, we analyze, based on the framework of analysis for atrocity crimes, a tool for prevention, which is a tool created by my office, the assessment of the risk of the crime of genocide, risk of crimes against humanity, and war crimes from an early warning perspective. So using risk factors, we identify potential situations of concern. Understanding the risk factors as early warning signs that can lead to the commission of this crime is essential to prevention. This is a task for everyone in society, including academic institutions, and therefore one of the reasons for which I'm so pleased to be with you today. The mandate does not equip me with the prerogative of determining whether genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity have been committed. This only a competent, independent court of justice can determine. At the same time, accountability is central to my mandate, especially in situations where there are serious allegations of commission of atrocity crimes. And for this reason, it is important that all states ratify and implement the 1948 Convention and domesticate key tenets of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. So despite the world's knowledge of these early warning signs, often the political will, capacity, and resolve to act remains largely insufficient. There are too many situations worldwide where communities are at risk of atrocity crimes or where such crimes are ongoing, despite my office having put out early warning to all the relevant stakeholders. We do know that the foundations of genocide are helped along by otherization. The narrative of the other has been and continues to be consistently used to dehumanize and vilify on the basis of identity, contributing to exclusion, stigmatization, discrimination, isolation, hate crimes, racial injustice, and in the most serious instances, atrocity crimes that include genocide. And throughout history, a common tendency worldwide is often discerned from groups who regard themselves as normal while otherizing the rest of humankind. And we live in a reality of the fact that stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination culminating in racial injustice will often be whipped up by certain sections of the population, usually politicians. Racial injustice is a product of racism. And Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, speaking of racism, so many years ago said that the foulest intellectual rubbish ever invented by man is that of racial superiority and inferiority. He was not exaggerating. The pseudogenetic distinction of race that has no relevance to what a human being is capable of doing is a powerful social force that has been known to carry stereotypes and prejudice. And when one has power, allow for action on the basis of these stereotypes and prejudice, discriminating against groups of people on the basis of identity, sometimes leading to genocide. So as a little boy, Dr. King's mother, Alberta William King, explained otherization to him. She described its presence in their lives through discrimination and segregation. She told her son that he should feel a sense of somebodyness, but on the other hand, know that he would be facing a system that would be staring him in the face every day, telling him that he was less than, and you are not equal to. She explained the segregated schools, restaurants, theaters, and housing, as well as the white and colored signs as a social condition rather than a natural order. She said to him, Martin, you are as good as anyone. So we are familiar with these patterns. Hate contributes to dehumanization and enables an environment in which genocide is possible. Long before the Holocaust happened, discrimination, hate speech, and stigma was widespread against the Jewish community. In Rwanda, hate speech and the dehumanization of the Tutsi community was frequently utilized by political leaders, media, and others with influence before the genocide. In Myanmar, years of hatred and exclusionary rhetoric against the Rohingya Muslims, both online and offline, together with deeply discriminatory practices restricting these groups' access to basic services, freedom of movement, and other fundamental rights, led to a climate in which mass violence against this population occurred. And I would request of you, the next time you're in Washington, D.C., to please go to the Holocaust Museum and see the exhibition that's there right now on the Rohingya. In Iraq, the targeting of the Yazidi by Daesh was preceded by a long history of exclusion and marginalization of this community. So today, I can tell you, to my great sadness, that more than 2,800 Yazidi people, especially many of them women and girls, remain in captivity, and more than 600,000 persons impacted by these attacks continue living in internally displaced persons camps with violence persisting in their homes. So part of the challenge continues to be the inability to act early and to proactively address risk factors long before the onset of a crisis. In other words, early warning must be met with early response. From history, we do know genocide is not a random or spontaneous event, and neither does it occur in a vacuum. Genocide constitutes the end point of a process which develops over time, where risk factors and warning signs are present. The most central of these risk factors and early warning signs is patterns of intergroup tension or systematic discrimination, human rights violations, and hate speech, targeting ethnic, racial, religious, or national minorities, which are the groups under the 1948, protected under the 1948 Genocide Convention. So a lot has been done towards preventing genocide. The core of the United Nations legal approach to racial injustice is the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, overseen by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We have Security Council, General Assembly, and Human Rights Council resolutions. The 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide has now been ratified by 153 United Nations member states, demonstrating its significance. The most recent ratification was last year in July 2022 by the Republic of Zambia. Some UN member states who have ratified, though, are yet to fully domesticate genocide and other international crimes in their criminal codes, which limits the space to address the crimes even when they are allegedly committed in the country. So we must keep supporting these United Nations member states who have not yet ratified to do so. The international community and the United Nations have also been instrumental in setting the judicial mechanisms necessary to determine genocide as a crime. These include the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR. Genocide is also defined as an international crime in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. The International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals continuing the ICTY and ICTR jurisdiction, and the law on the establishment of the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, a UN-assisted tribunal, also have jurisdiction over genocide as defined in the convention. Some states have also criminalized genocide in domestic law. And in a 2021 landmark trial, Frankfurt's higher regional court sentenced a member of Daesh for the crime of genocide in a verdict that constituted a first against a member of Daesh for the commission of this crime. The country of Gambia also brought a case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice regarding the 2017 violence against the Rohingya Muslims by utilizing the provisions of the Genocide Convention and the mandate of the ICJ to settle disputes related to it. So we do know that many, however, continue to live under a perpetual state of alert to the commission of these crimes on them. Many live prepared for the worst, and this is an intolerable existence. This is even more so where these crimes, despite having been conclusively proven in lengthy legal processes to have happened, continue to be denied. So the deniers ignore historical facts and judicial decisions, the persistence of speech denying or distorting the facts of the Holocaust, the genocides in Srebrenica, Bosnia-Herzegovina, against the Bosniak Muslims, and in Rwanda, against the Tutsi, is a concern that the United Nations is confronting. And to this end, last year, my office, in partnership with the Jacob Lawson Institute, published a policy paper, Combating Holocaust and Genocide Denial, Protecting Survivors, Preserving Memory, and Promoting Prevention. And we pointed out that the denial of past atrocity crimes is a warning sign of societal fragility and of the potential for violence. It is right that we remember the crimes that were committed in the Holocaust in Rwanda, in Srebrenica. It is right that these crimes are properly registered and documented. It is right that we pay attention to the spaces and to the processes that led to the commission of these crimes. It is right that we archive and study the information on these crimes. It is right that we understand the risk factors and indicators that led to these crimes. And in so doing, we shall remain vigilant and ensure support, non-recurrence, and take prompt action when such risk emerges. I emphasize these three because we rely on judicial processes to point out where a genocide has happened or not. So as I acknowledge the importance of judicial action so that victims find some measure of redress and that allegations find their day in courts, I also acknowledge that accountability constitutes an important step on the path towards prevention of future crimes. Justice alone, however, is insufficient to heal a society, yet no healing is possible without justice. We also do live in realities in which reliance upon legal defenses can only be used where the rule of law and orderly political change is fully accepted, and constitutional safeguards are sometimes not enough to resolve cultural tensions and racial injustices. The global challenges and opportunities we are facing require action at all levels, from government level to communities, and I will mention a few initiatives we are working on. So at the United Nations, the Secretary General has made combating hate speech a priority through the strategy and plan of action on hate speech that he launched in June 2019. So my office is a UN focal point on hate speech, and we coordinate efforts in the UN in line with this strategy. We support UN field presences globally to develop and implement national action plans on countering hate speech and preventing atrocity crimes. We also work closely with UN member states, regional bodies, and civil society to support efforts to tackle hate speech in line with the international human rights standards and the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Globally, my office also works closely with tech and social media companies on their role in countering online hate speech. Offline and online hate speech is a risk factor for atrocity crimes, including genocide. The social media dynamic of online hate speech may be global, but consequences are local and directly affect the way people relate. Here in America, on October 27, 2018, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania witnessed the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in United States history. Pittsburgh community leaders, determined to be remembered more for their global leadership against hate and not just the terrible act of hate that happened in their midst, meet annually for the Eradicate Hate Global Summit. They invited me to 2 of these summits, and I met the Pittsburgh leaders. I also met the survivors from Buffalo, where a gunman killed 10 people and wounded 3 in a racist attack at a grocery store in a predominantly Black neighborhood. In Pittsburgh and Buffalo, the shooters posted hate messages online, mentioning the communities they wished to destroy. They are actually, if you look at what they posted, it was very, very similar. We have since created, in partnership with the communities of Pittsburgh and Buffalo and other places in the United States, a UN Summit Sports Working Group, partly in recognition of the power of sports, but also in recognition that many of these active shooters are themselves active followers of sports groups. And our UN Sport Working Group is composed of representatives of various sports leagues and partners who include the Pittsburgh Steelers, Major League Baseball, Boston Red Sox, Fenway Sports Group, Buffalo Bills, Major League Soccer, National Football League, Buffalo Sabres, United States Women's National Soccer Team, the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Pittsburgh Pirates, the National Association for Stock Car Racing, NASCAR, Major League Soccer, MLS, National Basketball Association, NBA, Women National Basketball Association, WNBA, Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, National Hockey League, NHL, Pegula Sports and Entertainment, the Anti-Defamation League Sports Leadership Council, and CNX Sports. And outside of the US, we also have the Liverpool Football Club. And to commemorate the 74th anniversary of the December 9th, 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the UN Secretary General launched our UN Summit Sports Working Group Plan of Action for Countering Hate Speech through engagement with sport, based on the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, and again, fully aligned with international human rights law, in particular, the right to freedom of expression and opinion. So this, the plan of action has been shared and continues to be shared with sports leagues and athletes worldwide. And we are looking forward to engaging with sports communities here in Michigan. It's one of the things I promised to do was come and speak to you at the Michigan community and say, please, can we engage with you on this and other ways that we are working on preventing atrocity crimes. So my office has also launched 2 initiatives on the role of education in atrocity prevention. In 1947, the first United Nations report on discrimination emphasized that the whole field to prevent discrimination requires a vast program of education. Global challenges and opportunities for the prevention of genocide often present contradictions through education. As happened in the apartheid system in South Africa, where racist ideologies were manufactured in universities, education can retain and reinforce racial injustice. So the work my office is doing supports positive outcomes on the development of syllabus and learning materials for university courses on the prevention of atrocity crimes, that is genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This covers global standards and good practices in atrocity prevention, with detailed contextual focus on approaches and good practices to atrocity prevention. So we now have a course that's currently being piloted in 2 universities, in Chulalongkorn University in Thailand and the Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia. My office has also supported the integration of atrocity crimes prevention into secondary school education through development of a teacher's manual and through training of teachers from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. A similar project is also being supported in the African region, where scholars met in Dakar, Senegal, to develop curriculum. So the initiative the African initiative is interdisciplinary and focuses on how genocide prevention can be integrated as part of university learning, not only in legal or political studies, as is often the case, but rather making it a fundamental course for all students, linking it to multiple subjects and disciplines. We plan to expand this initiative to other regions and create a global network of educators and scholars on atrocity prevention. And the last place where we had this discussion, I went to Baghdad and to the University of Baghdad, and we are starting a process with the University of Baghdad as well. So I strongly believe that placing communities at the core of prevention of genocide, when sufficiently and sustainably supported, can be instrumental to effective action on racial injustices. It is imperative that those with influence in communities, political, religious, community, and civil society leaders, be agents of transformation, contribute to changing narratives, and encourage everyone to do their part to advocate for, build, and sustain a coexistence based on racial justice and prevention of genocide. The strength of community stakeholders lies in their in-depth knowledge of the local context and their ability to detect risk factors and warning signs much sooner than anyone else. In my office, we have developed specific plans of action, and we have one plan of action for religious leaders and actors on their role in preventing incitement to violence, which we call the first plan of action because we named it after the city in Morocco where we drafted it, that could lead to atrocity crimes. We are developing a similar plan of action for traditional leaders. Supporting groups that represent women's interests and promote women's rights to advance racial justice is one of the priorities I have made in the discharge of my mandate. And our plan of action on the role of women in atrocity prevention will be launched in New York in May this year. So ending racial injustice and preventing genocide begins with being knowledgeable. We must have as much information as possible. We must keep commemorating, we must keep organizing, not only to honor and keep the memory of the victims alive, but also as a reminder that so long as racial injustice exists, the risk of genocide remains real. We must keep asking difficult questions on what feeds racial injustice. We must unpack the fear of difference, vested interests, mythologies of racial purity, and of course, domination. We must not tire of examining how racial injustice manifests, what its effects are, how it can be addressed and countered. How do we emphasize existing historical precedents promoting racial justice? How do we keep emphasizing honest attempts to apply the principles of social equality while renouncing the advantages of exploitation? How do we address stereotypes held by everyone, minorities and majorities? The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in his common agenda, has called for a new social contract for the world, which integrates employment, sustainable development, social protection based on equal rights and opportunities for all. The common agenda needs the support of the world. Ultimately, despite international legal standards prohibiting inequality and discrimination, national practice at enforcement continues to be difficult. We still require huge amounts of political will, huge amounts of education, advocacy, and above all, research into what discriminatory practices societies are outraged by and why, the complexity and diversity of racial injustices in many countries, including racial discriminatory practice and the grounds for discrimination. We must keep working with academic communities to acquire knowledge on linking racial justice to the prevention of atrocity crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And as Dr. Martin Luther King said, the alternative to strengthening the United Nations and thereby the whole world may well be a civilization plunged into the abyss of annihilation. So part of what we can do every day individually as part of this global response is what Martin Luther King's mother did. Keep teaching children in the world experiencing racial injustice to feel a sense of somebodyness, even as the system stares them down, telling them that they are less than and not equal to. In this way, we too can raise Dr. King's who challenge inequality, discrimination, and segregation. Often, when I reflect on the roles we now play in ending racial injustice, including the role I now hold as the first woman in the position of the Special Advisor of Prevention of Genocide under Secretary General, I know how difficult it is to imagine what the world might have been had it not been for the Dr. Martin Luther Kings and the Rosa Parks and those who worked alongside them to advance equal rights and justice, fighting deeply rooted racism and segregation. So for their inspiration to us, we can only say thank you, because it is the sense of somebodyness and self-respect they gave us that enable the pledge to keep fighting racial injustices. I'd like to conclude by saying thank you to you all once again. Racial injustices are linked to the commission of the crime of genocide, and they affect us all globally, directly and indirectly. Racial injustices are a global reality that require a global response. Quoting again, drawing on the infinite wisdom of Dr. Martin Luther King again, I will draw on his reflections on what he called the inescapable network of mutuality. And he said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So nobody should feel that they are so removed from racial injustice that it doesn't affect them. It does. You may not feel it directly, but it does. I thank you very much.
That was magnificent. Thank you so much, Undersecretary General. What a pleasure to hear from you. And I think one of the things that is always a challenge is we hear grand speeches, but we don't often hear practical ways to implement things. And that's where I find these plans of actions, the working with the sports communities. I have to say, our family is a huge Liverpool fan. So my son's very first tattoo, as soon as he turned 18 and didn't have to have my approval, you shall never walk alone. You'll never walk alone. So very happy to hear that Liverpool is the only outsider from the American sports. I think it's really important too that we talk about the duty of memory. I want to ask you a question based on what you said and the work that you and your office are doing under the Secretary General's new common agenda, trying to integrate the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because that's one aspect or one language of human dignity that, in fact, Professor Mikau Mutua spoke about last year, and that human rights is only one such language to address human dignity. But there are other languages, and we see some of that in what you've spoken about and in the Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother talking to him about the importance of somebodyness. And but we're seeing a massive pushback right now in the United States of, I don't know if I would call it a pushback against somebodyness, but an attempt to, I think what some pushing for the exclusions of books and language and teaching is perhaps their attempt at getting away from the otherness, but in fact, it is just highlighting more of the otherness. So while we have your office and, you know, the General Assembly of states that are not on the Security Council pushing for atrocity prevention, asking the tough questions, but we know that the General Assembly is an advisory body, and your role does not have the force of law. You can investigate, you can alert, you can highlight, hoping to prevent. But what can be done with countries like the United States, although we are not alone, unfortunately, that are pushing back, including legally? It's one thing to decide that I don't want my child to read this particular book, or to be taught in school about certain things that maybe I object to on religious or ethical or whatever considerations, but to insist that no one else has that right either is really a step that's going very far. Is there anything that we can do, whether it's on campus, whether it's, in our schools, working with school boards, school districts, because that's where this discriminatory language is coming from. And if we're preventing talk about all of us, do you see that as a sign that we could be going in the wrong direction?
Thank you for that question that really cuts to the core of what the US, like as an outsider, what I see the US as grappling with. I must tell you that before the elections, the last elections, I was that was just before I joined the UN, because I joined the UN just 2 years ago in this position. And I was hired as a consultant by some organizations here in the US to do an analysis on the country, like what did the country look like? That was before the elections. And so I did the analysis on the country, and then part of the analysis, when you're doing conflict analysis, you don't produce anything yourself. It has to come from people. So I had this huge group of people, and I was giving them different questions about the kind of things. Have you seen this? Have you seen this in your community? Have you seen this? So grouping all these risk factors, and then looking at it also from a predictive analysis perspective and how does this look like in terms of the future? What do you see this looking like? And when we were done, so we had the results coming up. They didn't consult each other. Some people are online, more than 500 people. And when we were done, then I showed them the risk factors that they put out for the US. And I shared the risk factors. I told them, look at what Rwanda looked like in 1993. Look at what Bosnia-Herzegovina looked like in 1994. This is the United States of America. This is where you are. And that was before the elections.
So could you just share with us what it looked like?
No, it looked very bad. It was there were all the risks. When you look at risk factors, I talked about the framework of analysis that we use in the office. But even before joining this office, I used to do lots of conflict analysis and atrocity crime analysis. And at that time, I was working on conflict analysis for the US, not atrocity crimes analysis, but the results that were coming across were on the basis of, were responding to atrocity crimes and speaking to the fact that the kind of things that we see as risk factors, armed militias, the disobeying of the rule of law, and then all this hate speech targeted at identities, and then silos, people living and not wanting to mix with other people, like all of them present in the United States, which then would define this pushing back against the somebodiness, but also speaks to a fact of, because after that, no, even prior to that, I worked with a friend of mine who was a professor in Brattleboro in Vermont. Unfortunately, she died last year. And we worked with her after the elections, the ones before that, here in the US.
2016.
Yes, she had a program that she was calling Hands Over the Hills. We used to do this, we used to work together with her in Nepal, in Ethiopia. And then after the elections, she told me, the way I'm seeing my country, it needs the kind of help that we've been giving out there. So could you come over? So we did lots of that Hands Over the Hills with her. And we would sit with Democrats and we would sit with Republicans, so fast Republicans alone, where they would give us their thinking of what they think about Democrats, and we'll sit with Democrats, they'll tell us what they think about Republicans, then we'll get them all into one room and then have all these conversations about what it means to lose what is so core for Americans, which everyone out there knows that for Americans, the identity of being an American is so core that the assumption out there with everyone was that being an American was the larger identity than being all these other identities. And that has become eroded because of politics mainly. And that something is getting lost every day when nobody is speaking about the fact of America losing its Americanness. It's that pride that this is America. You know, when an American stands up somewhere, then everybody knows this is an American standing up, and there's something so great about being an American that is getting lost. And it's getting lost because, you know, all human beings, we have so many identities. Like we have racial identities. We are like, I'm a woman, teacher, you know, all that. And you know what happens when identities are challenged, the one that you feel is challenged, then gains greater significance in your mind and to the people around you who are like you. You start hanging out with people who think and talk like you. And then the silos keep growing. Nobody's speaking to the other. Nobody's hearing the other out. And we don't have leadership because I think we do need lots of leaders in the US who can speak that language of America is greater than all these identities. And that from those of us who are out there, we know that a weak America is very bad for the world. We need a very strong America in the sense of not getting into these spaces where then America becomes the example for other places in the world in terms of bad practice, in terms of all these attacks and all these killings. So, like, I've been following, for example, in Buffalo, like the court processes, because now I know people there personally, and you know, once you know people, then you get so attached to the issues. I've also been following the court cases in Pittsburgh for the shooters of both Buffalo and Pittsburgh, and thinking that something America needs that somebody to begin mobilizing a critical mass of people who stand for America and not stand for any of these people. Because if America doesn't do that, then we get to that space where then the representation of America becomes these shooters. So you're thinking America and you're thinking, oh, America is where people get shot, and that should not be the case. And so I think in terms of building this sense of subordinates, one of the things I pointed out when I was doing this initial analysis that I mentioned was that when you see people even joining school boards so that they can influence curriculum, like, what then does it mean? What kind of conversations have you had for somebody who's never done anything for a school to now think of joining a school board to go and influence curriculum? And we need to think about those kind of things. And then in terms of the whole sense of understanding what people need to do, I've talked about the leaders, and I've talked about that gap, because there's a very huge gap. I see it every day. I keep thinking to myself, so who is it I need to speak to in the United States today for us to then begin mobilizing and to get people understanding that if anything begins, it will be very difficult to stop it. We've seen it in other contexts. It begins with one person and then it just rolls off into something that becomes something that you can't even hold anymore. And, like in Rwanda at the Kigali Memorial Museum, there's a small sign there that's very significant, because it says genocides. People assume genocides happen when millions of people are killed. The thinking is always millions of people are being killed. But it's what people don't realize is that it's 6 people here, and then 5 people there, and then 20 there, and then 60 there, and then 90 there. Then one day you add up the numbers and you say, wait a minute, we have 6 million on our hands. How did this happen? So it's a very important time right now for America to have a very strong conversation with itself in terms of looking at so many aspects. And some of we looked at when we were writing the plan of action with the sports teams, we had on hate speech in consideration of the fact that the freedom of expression is so strongly protected in this country. And it's a good thing that it is, because people need to speak out. So we had all these conversations because we have a definition of hate speech in the UN strategy and plan of action. But that definition is not universal. It's the UN's definition. It's not the definition of the US. It's not the definition of other countries in the world. So we had all these conversations about what's hate speech? What exactly is hate speech? What constitutes hate speech? When do we term what's happening online, for example, what's being amplified online? When do we term that as being hate speech? And when is it free speech? And so we concluded that for the US, where a definition of hate speech doesn't exist, we need to be looking at what point do we look at the type of information that's put out there that meets the threshold of incitement to violence. So if that, whatever is put out meets that threshold, then you can begin to have a conversation around that. And just to say on Liverpool, we are going to Liverpool because the Liverpool Football Club has mobilized all the football clubs in the UK, and they will be handing over officially the plan of action to all the football clubs and I will remember you when we go there. Yeah, thank you.
Exciting, thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question before I turn it over to the audience. When you talk about judicial strategies, which, okay, I'm a lawyer, we get that, understand that makes perfect sense. But in lots of communities, whether it's the ICE, in the past, I mean, there are now residual courts with the ICTY and ICTR, but a lot of people find these courts very far removed, very far away in The Hague, or in the case of the ICTR, when it first started, in Arusha in Tanzania, and then the appellate court, of course, in The Hague. But lots of communities are doing all kinds of reconciliation work, peace building, which you are very intimately connected to. And when I was working on South Sudan, this emphasis on a hybrid court, or even when I was political officer at the embassy in Kigali, working on this, on the ICTR, the fact that the accused are in these, I mean, yes, it's still a jail, but relative to the way that the average person is living, whether they personally were affected by the genocide or mass atrocities or not, is significantly better than their lives. And in the case of a lot of African trials, they're given antiretrovirals, they're given treatment that the ordinary population doesn't receive. But again, it's looking at a judicial structure, regardless of where, versus or without the accompanying reconciliation and duty to community that a lot of these communities have. And so is that not also kind of recreating an otherness, because not just where the alleged perpetrators are taken and how they're treated, but also, if we take the case of, well, any of these cases where you have a racial divide, especially a country like Rwanda, which really well, it has three ethnicities. One can debate whether they're actual, I mean, they share more common traits than differences. But when it is now the genocide against the Tutsi, and how do we account for people, again, wherever people are protesting against discrimination, but who are not of that group, of that class. So, you know, Hutus were killed, people who were shopping in Buffalo who didn't happen to live in that neighborhood, or who found themselves in that area because they do live in that community, but they were ostensibly not the main target. How do we avoid those sorts of things, but also have reconciliation take place at the community level? I'm sorry, that was a very long-winded question.
Thank you, but I got it. In terms of judicial processes and, for example, the ICC, the role of the ICC, I, for one, coming from Kenya, know what it means to rely on a court that is so far away, that to be sitting there and thinking, okay, now we are waiting for the ICC to come and solve our problems. And then the ICC doesn't.
Although, if I could interject, they tried. I mean, the idea with Kenya was, we're going to try to have a chamber for these atrocity crimes, and we are going to try to pass legislation in the parliament, and they failed. And it was only if we cannot do that, then we would hand over the names to Kofi Annan to take to the ICC. So not quite, we're just handing it over.
No, the parliamentarians made a choice. They were given the choice.
Fair.
Do you want the ICC or do you want a local tribunal? And they chose the ICC.
Okay.
And part of choosing the ICC was that they probably felt that it should take a long time and, you know, that kind of thing. But I'm now talking about, because I used to work for the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and I was on the ground when these things were happening. I saw them unfold. We were putting out statements all the time saying, this is going to happen. Please, will somebody stop this? It's going to happen. Then it happened. So from the perspective of somebody on the ground, sitting there and waiting for an international court to solve the problems, then realizing that that doesn't quite work. Part of that drives so much of the work that I do in terms of pushing for domestication of these conventions that have been ratified. For example, the 1948 convention, because if your country ratifies the Genocide Convention, then and domesticates, then there is latitude in terms of domesticating, in terms of what you can do. You can include your homegrown approaches to preventing of genocide. You can also include the templates like that would be out there. And so like for a country like Ethiopia, which actually was one of the first to ratify this convention, the Genocide Convention protects specific groups, ethnicity, race, nationality, religion. And for Ethiopia, they added political. So you can actually be tried, and they have actually tried people, including their former prime minister, and found him guilty of genocide from a political perspective. Argentina as well has done a lot in terms of domesticating the convention, the Genocide Convention. They've done quite a lot. It's a case worth studying, looking at what they've done. So for reconciliation, away from the judicial processes, we've been having that conversation, and we are going to hold this year a meeting, a forum, where we are inviting traditional leaders from around the world, where to discuss what are the homegrown methods, what are the indigenous methods of preventing atrocity crimes. And so we are going to invite, for example, you know, like if in West Africa, you'll meet all these griots, people who have the history of their communities, and they'll speak to us about all that. We already had one meeting in Abuja with traditional leaders. I mentioned that there's a plan of action that's cooking. And these plans of action, by the way, that I was mentioning, they are so specific. They are detailed. We look at all aspects of what is it that we need to do. So like for the sports plan of action, we were looking at what can not just sports teams do, what can we do with existing rules for sports clubs? What can we do with about funds? What can we do with the team itself? You know, that kind of thing. So the judicial processes are never enough alone. Judicial processes also, like in many parts of the world, the courts are so far. Sometimes a court is 600 miles away from you, and that's where you are to find a process. So we were having a conversation with Jacob, who is sitting here, about some of these things today. And we were talking about what to do in the absence of a court process. And we're talking about how some communities like the Somali, they have, if you commit a crime, that your clan is held responsible for that crime, not you alone. And so your clan is the one that responds to that crime. And so, like, if you go to Kenya, in the northern part of Kenya, where the Somali people are to be found, you'll find the prisons empty. Not because murders are not being committed there, or crimes are not being committed there, but because the community prefers their method of dealing. Instead of taking somebody to court, which is a very lengthy process, and removing them from society, they prefer to deal with it in different ways. So in terms of, I've seen in terms of judicial processes too, that weakness of, so what happens after you serve your term? In Bosnia-Herzegovina, spent a lot of time in Bosnia-Herzegovina last year, and the former Yugoslavia, so many things going on in that space. And one of the things that was worrying me and keeps worrying is that concept of glorification of war criminals, where people who've been convicted for crimes, for genocide, crimes against humanity, their murals are everywhere. They are celebrated. Awards are given in their names. Roads are named after them. And so we were there, and we kept talking and pulling down and speaking to communities to take all this down. But and understanding that it's about them, they can decide to do this, but in terms of the bigger picture, they need to see the bigger picture. And also, I witnessed, for example, one person who had been who was convicted for the role that she played in conducting research that proved that biologically the Bosniak Muslims not sound of mind, and therefore they could be targeted. And she was jailed. And when she was released, she was received like a heroine. Huge celebration receiving her. And so when we think about judicial processes, then you see some of the weaknesses could be that kind of thing. However, we cannot, judicial processes help a lot. The ICC process in Kenya, despite its not having quite taken off, it really shook the country. We were able to start a lot of processes on prevention and transformation of conflict on the basis of what the ICC is about to do. So the people were shaken. People saw that things could happen, things that they'd never imagined before. So in terms of I've talked about the genocide against the Tutsi, and that's the official name. A resolution was passed that the official name of what happened in Rwanda is genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. It's not the genocide in Rwanda. And part of the reason for that is that when a person is being prosecuted for genocide, one of the key things that has to be proven is intent, specific intent. Did you intend to destroy in whole or in part this ethnic or racial community. And the intent to destroy the Tutsi is there. There's huge amounts of evidence, including the commandments, the 10 commandments that were read out on radio, including the mobilization on radio, asking people to move and kill the people, the Tutsi on this side and on the other side, including the description of the Tutsi in school textbooks as cockroaches, including, I mean, it's all there. So the intent is there. So the whole argument then in terms of changing the name to be Genocide Against the Tutsi in Rwanda became that if the Tutsi were not being killed, then the Hutu moderates would not have been killed. The intention was to kill the Tutsi. Sure. If the Hutu moderates were standing in the way, then they got killed. But the intention that was very clear was to kill the Tutsi. And it was the same for the intention that was there to kill the Jews, the intention that was there to kill the Roma. So, and very well documented, for example, evidence of the intention to kill and to completely, not just kill, to completely destroy in whole or in part these people. So I get that question all the time. Each time I say genocide against the Tutsi, there'll always be somebody who will be saying, what about the Hutu moderates who died? Doesn't it matter? And I say it matters, but this is the reasoning behind it. And then on there's a point you raised earlier about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN has Sustainable Development Goals. And these Sustainable Development Goals speak about the basics: food, security, shelter, encompasses all socioeconomic rights, as well as civil and political rights. And when you look at the framework of analysis, you can actually invert it in terms of understanding that what I always say, that every failed SDG, every failed Sustainable Development Goal is actually a risk factor for genocide. So it's so important to look at the Sustainable Development Goals that way, and to think about what then happens when people are so desperate and what drives people towards these kind of things. And just one example, when we talk about climate change, this discussion on climate change has been going on for a very long time. And there have all these discussions on why doesn't it pick up traction, and is it the way it's being messaged? And I can tell you that if you look at the way like the Sahara Desert is advancing, it's just incredible. If we did a study on Lake Chad was a lake. It was, I'm talking about the past tense, a lake that people fished, a lake that people went from one side to the other with a boat, and now it's dried up. And people now walk across the lake. And I think when you think about those kind of factors, it's important to think of, so what happened to the fishermen, the people who are sustained by that lake, what happened to them? And then when you think about the extremism in that whole region in the Sahel, then you begin to picture what extremists, what failed Sustainable Development Goals can speak to.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a few minutes to take questions from the audience. Stand up and just say briefly who you are and your affiliation, and then ask your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Joel Basoga. I'm a Ugandan. I'm a student pursuing a Master of Laws degree at the law school here. I'm also taking Professor Pages' class on law and diplomacy. So, it's been a very great pleasure listening to you, Under Secretary General. I found great inspiration in your laying out the historical and legal framework for the definition of the crime of genocide, but also how that links to Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy. My comment, perhaps a question, lies on the dichotomy between the role that international institutions and national institutions can play in both prevention and accountability. Of course, international institutions have been criticized because, given the existence of the Convention Against Genocide and accountability mechanisms at the UN, that did not stop some genocides from happening. But also, when we think about national institutions in terms of accountability, like in my country, Uganda, our judicial institutions, although on paper they are independent, they're very much well infiltrated and have sometimes significant bias as they handle sensitive issues. My question then can be, how best can national frameworks be equipped to guard against both the prevention and create a better accountability system, especially also because it can be interesting when people are choosing between an international institution because of the perceived idea of independence, but then there's a question of political democratic legitimacy to preside over these crimes. So how best can national frameworks be equipped to help in the prevention role and accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Halbert Ocheski. I'm an undergraduate student doing a joint degree in history and naval architecture and marine engineering. And I have a question regarding something you said about justice after a situation of genocide, and how that's not necessarily enough to heal a nation that has been shattered by these events. And so what I'm wondering is, in 1999, the US intervened in the Kosovo Civil War. And I'm wondering, I guess, in a similar situation where there is not necessarily UN agreement on intervention, at least within the Security Council, when is it the right move for nations to intervene? What would be the consequences of failing to intervene? Or like what factors should go into that decision to intervene in a situation like what was happening there and what has happened elsewhere in the past? And related to that, in situations after genocide has taken place, in, for example, a case where there was a successful intervention, what efforts should be taken in terms of prosecuting those involved? Is it beneficial, for example, to prosecute the foot soldiers of a genocidal action? Or is it more beneficial to take another approach, either in terms of re-education or something else, in terms of dealing with that after the fact?
I think you will never have enough time to answer everything. Let's do in the front, in the second row. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Professor Sylvia Pedraza, Sociology and American Culture. And when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, this was a long time ago, I took a graduate seminar with Professor William J. Wilson, Afro-American, which was excellent, on theories of race relations and so on. And we asked him at one point, I said, has there ever been any two people in the world who were different but could live together side by side in peace? And he said the Hutu and the Tutsi. I mean, that was a long time before the genocide, but that's exactly my point. I'm thinking about your, the symptoms that you can see in a society, the risk factors, I think is what you call them. And I think if you could give us a list of the risk factors, it would be very useful, because obviously people couldn't see it before it happened.
Great, thank you so much. That's a lot to get through, but if you can, thank you all for the questions.
Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Hello, my name is Shimon Lichtman. I am a master's student in the International and Regional Studies program with a Southeast Asia focus. And I was wondering what kind of work is being done in like post-genocide societies to address sort of like collective trauma or generational trauma in the wake of a genocide. I'm thinking specifically of Cambodia, where you had killing on such a massive scale that it's impacted essentially everybody in society, and those impacts continue to reverberate today. So I'm wondering what work is being done around those issues.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. So, so in the interest of time, I'll go very fast with the answers. So how can we best equip national institutions of infiltrated judiciaries? And I would say that ultimately, very many countries find themselves in the position that you've just explained. And everything relies on leadership and mobilizing. And I say so from having been the country I come from, we had a similar situation. And I do remember that the violence that happened in Kenya in 2007 and 2008, we were able to directly attribute it to the fact of one part of among those who are disputing the elections, one of them being very clear that they did not trust the courts, they did not trust the judiciary. So we ended up having violence. And so after that, then when we got we had this whole process of Kofi Annan then coming into the country and putting together a very good peace accord, which was actually protected in law and which put in place all these short-term ways in which the country could be that the short-term solutions to the problems the country had and long-term solutions, creating institutions. Like, for example, we had an institution on for the judiciary that looked at the kind of judges, all of them that were interviewed, they looked at their papers and they were able to weed out those who were corrupt. And it was a very painful process. Some of it was even done on national television. It was very painful, but it happened. So much depends on leadership and so much depends on organizing. So I would say that we should never tire of organizing in terms of thinking, what is it we can do if we got the opportunity to influence the leadership or to take up the leadership of a country. And then in terms of interventions, we always require a Security Council resolution to intervene. And when it doesn't happen, then it raises all kinds of issues. And part of the reason we have such so many conflicts going on right now is that the Security Council often does not agree. And in terms of whether to intervene or not, the Security Council is divided. We keep saying this all the time, and that we need to find ways in which the Security Council can work together so that they can make this kind of decisions. But the divisions in the world right now are such that it should worry all of us when we think about what then needs to happen. It doesn't mean that there isn't much being done. There's a lot being done behind the scenes, lots of trying to get people to agree. But I'm just calling on you as the community of Michigan to whatever you can do in your own individual space, like to keep working around, looking for ways in which we can be more efficient as a world. But the General Assembly has stepped in and has done quite a bit in terms of making decisions around some of the conflicts that we are seeing in the world. So in terms of should there be efforts to prosecute foot soldiers? Yes. I can tell you that in many contexts, these courts that I talked about, the ICTY, the ICTR, they go for the highest ranking decision-making person. And what then happens is that, and I've seen this in so many post-conflict societies, which is why people are so traumatized. The last question is that you often have to live next to your rapist or next to the person who killed your father, because there's nothing that you can do. The judicial processes do not reach you, and even if they reach you, there's so much compromise that has happened that it cannot happen, that there's no solution to that. So we do need to find ways to prosecute foot soldiers, especially because part of the reason why you see this nationalism growing in so many parts of the world is because foot soldiers are not prosecuted, and they are out there and they are doing all kinds of things. You know, the first time I went to Auschwitz, the thought that came to my mind was, so what happened to the people who drove the trains into Auschwitz? And I asked that question. So where are they now? And I was told, well, they got away with it because they are not the kind of people who are being tried. The Nuremberg trials were trying people who are more senior, who are giving orders. So yes, we must prosecute foot soldiers. And then in terms of the theories of race relation in the Hutu and the Tutsi, there are people who exist who actually don't, who can actually coexist and who coexist. And I've seen studies of, for example, the Khoisan people, and a lot of people who whose lives haven't been impacted by outside forces, that they are able to coexist because they know exactly what they need from each other. And so in terms of coexistence, it can happen. For the Hutu and the Tutsi, of course, there are many dynamics, including colonialism. So the prof was right, because before colonialism, they coexisted. After colonialism, that's when they did not coexist. And when this kind of measures are introduced, where you begin to think of really the divide and rule colonial approaches of you get one up over the other, you raise one up over the other. I mean, at the end of the day, you are really designing, because conflicts can be created. So it does exist. So now what I've spoken about, the analysis. So we have a document called the Framework of Analysis, and it's online, it's on our website. It has all those risk factors, but I'll also email it to Professor Stephen, and then he can put it out to everyone. And then for post-genocide societies, and I'll also email all the other documents that I've mentioned, the plan of action on hate speech, everything. For the post-genocide societies, Cambodia, and many others, I must say that this is one area where the world is not doing very well. There are so many traumatized societies. Ambassador, you know, like in South Sudan, the whole country is traumatized. Like decades and decades of war, and then a false promise, and then more war. And the trauma is huge. Some of the actions people take right now, when we see them as being aggressive and being all kinds of things, but so much has to do with trauma and processed trauma. And we do need to pay lots of attention to this. And there are organizations paying attention, but at the international level, this is really one of the things that I take away from Michigan, that we really, really need to pay attention to, to thinking about what it is that we can do with traumatized societies. Thank you.
I just want to say a huge thank you to Undersecretary General Alice Nderitu. It has been a real honor to have you here with us today. I'm sorry she didn't get to everyone's questions, but we are just thrilled that we have a framework to look at. And if I could just close with one of the things she said, we have to not be shy from leadership, from mobilization, organizing, use the framework as a tool for analysis to preventing and fighting against atrocities, discrimination. And let's make sure that we always try to remember to be the somebodies and not the others. And I remember the slogan growing up, at least as little Black children, I am somebody. So somebodyness. Thank you so much.